The Belgian Congo Free State, 1885 to 1908. At the end of the 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium wanted an empire, but not the responsibility of governing one. So he took the Congo for himself, not for Belgium, but as his private estate. He convinced European powers he was bringing civilization to Central Africa. What he brought was a regime of quotas, guns, and rubber. The new European demand for rubber was insatiable. Leopold's agents forced villages to harvest sap from wild vines under the threat of punishment. When workers failed to meet their quotas, soldiers cut off hands to prove they hadn't wasted bullets. Children were taken as hostages, whole communities were destroyed. The profits were immense, and so were the casualties. By the time international outrage forced Leopold to surrender control in 1908, millions had died. Records suggest as many as 10 million people. Leopold used that wealth to cover Belgium with monuments and parks while the archives of his Congo were burned. Today, the Congo Free State is almost absent from school books, but its silence is a chapter in itself. The story of how Europe invented a humanitarian mission and called it progress while turning a continent into currency.
The Japanese Empire in Asia, 1895 to 1945. In less than half a century, Japan transformed from an isolated island nation into a mechanized empire that spanned oceans and justified its expansion through the phrase Asia for Asians. It promised liberation from Western colonizers, but delivered its own brand of dominance. What began with the annexation of Taiwan and Korea evolved into a campaign of invasion across China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia. The imperial army's code of discipline hid a machinery of cruelty. Prisoners were treated as expendable, civilians as property, and women across conquered territories were forced into sexual slavery as so-called comfort women. The Nanking Massacre of 1937 alone left hundreds of thousands dead and is still contested by those who prefer national myth to memory. Japan's industrial might was fueled by coerced labor and plundered resources from its colonies. By the time the Second World War ended in 1945, large-scale famine and bombing had laid the empire to ruin. Yet many of its architects escaped trial in exchange for Cold War cooperation. An empire that promised Asian unity collapsed under the weight of its own deceptions, a story rarely told in the textbooks that replaced its banners.
The Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368. In the 13th century, a tribal chieftain named Temujin, remembered as Genghis Khan, united the steppe and unleashed a storm that drowned half the world. From the Pacific to the Danube, his horsemen moved with speed and discipline no army had imagined. Their strategy was mathematical: submit and survive, resist and be erased. Cities like Nishapur and Baghdad were leveled so thoroughly that entire populations vanished and irrigation systems turned to dust. Chroniclers record heaps of skulls as symbols of order, not horror. And yet, parallel to that devastation, the Mongols opened trade routes, protected merchants, and moved ideas and technologies across continents. It was progress, purchased with fear. After Genghis, his grandsons built a geopolitical network stretching from China to Persia. But the empire rotted from its own scale. The descendants fought each other, and the plague followed their roads home. Today, the Mongol Empire is remembered for its efficiency and tolerance, far less for the mountains of dead that made both possible.
The Kingdom of Congo and the Atlantic slave trade, 15th to 19th century. Long before Europe conquered Africa outright, the Kingdom of Congo stood as a strong Christian-allied state on the west coast. Its kings welcomed Portuguese traders and priests in the hope of modernization and military supplies. What followed was 4 centuries of corruption and betrayal that fed the Atlantic slave trade. European and African elites collaborated in a system so profitable it devoured their own people. Captives from the interior were marched to Congo's ports, sold to foreign ships, and disappeared forever across the ocean. Wars were fought not for territory, but to manufacture slaves for sale. The kingdom fractured under the pressure, civil wars multiplying as European guns funded both sides. Millions of lives were lost, families obliterated, whole cultures dispersed. Yet the story is barely told because it defies simple morality, a trade built on shared greed, where perpetrators and victims swapped places until no one could claim innocence. Congo's empire never declared slavery a crime. It simply ran out of people to sell.
The Spanish Empire in the Americas, 1492 to the 1600s. Spain's discovery of the New World wasn't an age of exploration, it was an age of extraction. Armed with crosses and contracts, its conquistadors claimed entire continents in the name of God and gold. Within a generation, empires that had thrived for centuries, the Aztec, Inca, and Maya, were crushed beneath the weight of steel, disease, and forced conversion. Under the encomienda system, Native Americans were classified as wards of the crown, souls to be saved, bodies to be used. Mines in Potosi and Zacatecas consumed millions of lives. Silver from their hands financed Europe's luxury and war. The church argued over whether the indigenous had souls. The question was academic. They were dying too fast to answer. Spain called it evangelization. Its critics called it extermination. The New World was remade in the Old World's image, and the price of that remaking was everything that made it new.
The Portuguese Empire, 1415 to 1975. Portugal was the first European nation to build an oceanic empire and the last to let it go. From the coast of Africa to Brazil, India, and Timor, its flag flew for 5 centuries. Behind the romance of navigation and map-making lay a machine of enslavement and extraction. Portuguese captains mapped routes to the Gold Coast not for science, but for shipment of people. They built forts like Elmina as warehouses for captives, turning trade into tragedy that fed plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. Sugar, spices, and souls were measured in the same ledger. Even in Asia, Goa and Macau were kept obedient through faith and force, where conversion often meant cultural erasure. Portugal's empire outlasted most others by sheer inertia. Mozambique and Angola remained colonies until the 1970s. That longevity breeds forgetfulness. 500 years of commerce and mission, described as exploration, rarely is what it was, a global network of necessary violence that pretended to teach the world while selling it.
The Qing Empire in Central Asia, 1644 to 1912, China's last imperial dynasty, called itself the Middle Kingdom, but its reach was far from central. Under the Qing, the borders pushed west into Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia, folding entire ethnic worlds into Beijing's bureaucracy. To secure that power, the Qing state used a mix of diplomacy, surveillance, and erasure that would resonate for centuries. Resistance was met with deportation or massacre. The Dzungar genocide of the 1750s wiped out hundreds of thousands in Central Asia, replaced by colonists loyal to the throne. Local languages were suppressed, faiths regulated, and entire cultures recategorized as Chinese minorities. The empire that promised harmony built it by reducing a continent to subjects who couldn't speak their own names aloud. The Qing dynasty's administrative brilliance, its maps, its tax records, its plea of order, was the perfect cover for domination. It fell in 1912, but its boundaries didn't. They still define modern China's edges and its unresolved silences.
The Ottoman Empire and the Devshirme system, 14th through 19th century. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire spanned 3 continents and called itself a protector of faith and order. Yet behind its splendid mosques and disciplined bureaucracy was a system built on abduction. Through the practice known as Devshirme, Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers or bureaucrats. Those who excelled became janissaries, an elite force that guarded the Sultan while never being truly free. The program was admired for its efficiency and meritocracy. It was also a form of state-sponsored kidnapping. Generations of boys grew into men who no longer knew their birth names or languages. Few eras illustrate so clearly how an empire can praise loyalty while manufacturing it through loss.
The Ottomans called it service to God. Its victims called it a life that belonged to someone else. The Dutch East India Company VOC and colonial Java 1602 to 1799. The world's first joint stock corporation wasn't a business so much as a private state. Chartered by the Netherlands with rights to wage war and sign treaties, the VOC turned the Spice Islands of Indonesia into its own laboratory of profit. Nutmeg and clove were worth fortunes in Europe. On the islands, they cost entire villages. Company mercenaries slaughtered populations on Banda to monopolize trade and forced locals to work under contract so ruthless it outlasted slavery by name only. In Batavia, modern Jakarta, executions kept the markets obedient and the shareholders satisfied. For 200 years, the VOC was praised as the engine of global commerce. The corporate charter it invented became the blueprint for empire without emperor. When the company finally collapsed under corruption and debt, the Dutch state simply absorbed its territories. Capitalism didn't replace imperialism, it learned how to mask it in ledgers and logos.
The Assyrian Empire, 900 to 609 BCE. Long before Rome or Britain dreamed of conquest, the Assyrians perfected it. From the city of Nineveh, their kings forged one of history's earliest superstates, an empire built on organization and terror in equal measure. They did not conquer secretly. They wanted their violence to echo. Campaigns through Mesopotamia and the Levant left cities burned and survivors shackled. Assyrian inscriptions celebrate rather than hide brutality. Walls carved with images of flaying, impalement, and chains of captives driven from homeland to homeland. Terror was policy. Spread fear far enough, and armies surrender before battle begins. It worked for centuries. It also made enemies everywhere. When Babylon and Medes rose against them, Nineveh was erased as thoroughly as its victims had been before. The Assyrians' legacy is architecture, ironworking, and an idea that every tyrant since has copied. Rule not by persuasion, but by displaying the consequences of doubt.
The French Empire in Algeria, 1830 to 1962. France sailed to North Africa, claiming to bring civilization and law. Instead, it brought settlers and scorched earth. From 1830 onward, Algeria was treated not as a colony, but as an extension of France itself, cleansed of its people to make room for Europeans. Villages were flattened to plant vineyards, lands seized by legal fiat, and entire tribes driven into the desert. When Algerians rose for independence in 1954, the French army answered with camps and torture centers. Casualty estimates ran into hundreds of thousands. Both sides fought dirty, but one side fought inside people's homes. Even after independence in 1962, France refused to speak of what had been done in its name. Paris still calls Algeria a cradle of culture and connection. Algerians call it a grave with no headstones. The empire ended 6 decades ago, but its silence has aged better than its justice.
The Roman Empire in Britain and Gaul, 43 BCE to 476 CE. Rome boasted that it brought roads, law, and sanitation to its conquered lands. What it mostly brought was submission. When Caesar and his successors carved their way through Gaul and Britain, they did so claiming that Latin and order would replace barbarism. Villages that resisted were razed, and their populations enslaved to build the very roads celebrated as Roman gifts. Under Roman rule, Britain became a frontier fortified by walls and taxes. The Druidic religion was exterminated, Gaulish tongues were driven into silence by Latin edict. Peace under Rome, the so-called Pax Romana, was merely the moment between rebellions when Romans were too tired to kill. Crucifixion was its public language of law, punishment designed to be seen from far away. Historians celebrate its architecture and administration, its subjects remembered tax collectors and chains. Rome civilized the West by proving that nothing spreads faster than infrastructure attached to terror.
The Sikh Empire under Ranjit Singh, 1799 to 1849.
In the early 19th century, Maharaja Ranjit Singh forged a united Punjab out of fractured kingdoms, creating a frontier strong enough to hold off both Afghanistan and Britain for a generation. He built a multi-religious state where Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims served together, yet beneath that idealism was unyielding discipline and a militarized economy. To keep his army paid and his borders secured, he imposed strict taxes and expanded by force, subduing hill chiefs and minor princes. Those who resisted were flattened. Those who obeyed were absorbed. His death triggered succession murders and British intervention that finished what his sword had begun. Today, he is celebrated as the Lion of Punjab, protector of faith and nation. But his empire also shows the price of unity when it depends on permanent readiness for war, a peace kept by the fear of its own army.
The Aztec Empire, 1428 to 1521. In the center of what is now Mexico, the Aztecs built a glittering empire over less than a century, binding dozens of cities into a single state governed from Tenochtitlan. Its temples rose like mountains out of the lake, and its military was unmatched in discipline. Beneath that grandeur ran a theology that demanded blood to sustain the sun. Conquest brought tribute and captives. Every campaign fed markets and altars. Human sacrifice wasn't random cruelty, but ritual state policy. It reinforced the emperor's power and kept subject nations terrified. Some neighboring peoples aligned with the Spanish, not out of admiration for Europe, but from exhaustion with the Aztecs' constant need for victims. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, disease and betrayal destroyed the empire faster than European steel alone ever could. Yet even after its fall, colonial chroniclers exaggerated its horrors to justify their own. The Aztec Empire died violently, but its cruelty lived on in the stories of those who used it as an alibi for conquest.
The British Empire, 17th to 20th century. At its height, a quarter of humanity lived under the Union Jack. Britain called it a mission of trade, law, and light. In reality, it was extraction, perfected into bureaucracy. Ships and railways carried goods outward and chains inward. Millions in India, Africa, and the Caribbean were moved, taxed, or starved to balance ledgers drawn in London. The empire's great famines, like Bengal in 1943, were blamed on weather while grain was exported abroad. Indentured servitude replaced slavery in name, but not in practice, and entire societies were reshaped to supply cheap labor and raw material. Yet the British public was taught to see railways, cricket, and English schools as proof of benevolence. When decolonization came after World War, London withdrew gracefully and silently rewrote the narrative, a civilizing project done, not undone. What remains is the plainest truth about every empire on this list. They call it building the world only until the world learns to speak for itself.